One of the most highly anticipated underwater horror games just released an early demo on Steam. You might remember me mentioning Full Fathom a while back when I talked about Iron Lung spin-offs, or lung-likes as I like to call them. And given that I've covered Subnautica and Iron Lung in so many past videos, you know I had to give this one a spin. And boy do I have a lot to say about it. First off, we should get the obvious stuff out of the way. Full Fathom clearly takes a lot of inspiration from both Subnautica and Iron Lung, but it's not exactly like either one of these games. This isn't the Subnautica 2 or Iron Lung 2 that you might be looking for. Sure, you've got that core gameplay of piloting a submarine through a spooky ocean full of dangerous marine life, but maybe not like you'd expect. More so than either of its predecessors, Full Fathom is largely about your submarine. The sub itself is massive compared to its counterparts, featuring a bunch of rooms, including a bridge, storage, switch room, engine room, and a handful of others. And keeping it running in good condition is a full-time job. For example, you could be trying to navigate the map when a fire breaks out in the engine room. So you sprint back to the engines only to realize the sub doesn't have power, so you can't start the sprinklers. On your way to the switch room, a hole in the hull opens up and starts flooding the storage chamber. So you grab your repair hammer and some scrap, patch up the hole, and crank a bilge pump to empty out the water. Next, you make your way back to the switch room and flip the breakers, kicking power back on for the rest of the sub. With that working, you're able to run all the way back to the engine room, start the sprinklers to put out the engine fires, only to realize that you're completely out of fuel. Yeah, keeping the sub up and running is a big part of the game, but it's not all you're going to be doing. Luckily, you have a handy, clippy-esque buddy who follows you around repeating helpful and sometimes annoying tips like,
"We are out of the red."
I think this character is a genius idea for an in-game guide, because most AAA games nowadays already have a pretty patronizing guide throughout the whole experience. This just fully leans into that cheesiness in the best way possible. So 10 out of 10 for that. More games could definitely use clippy helpers. But since I'm talking about tutorialization, ironically I actually think this game could use more of it. More than any indie game I've played this year, Full Fathom is dense. Almost to an overwhelming level when you first start. Like, see all those tiny knobs, gauges, and switches scattered around the bridge? Well, they're not just for looks. Almost every last one of them relates to a real feature in the game, with quite a few of them being crucial to standard gameplay. You've got some obvious ones like fuel and power gauges, and a throttle that you can adjust to set your speed. But who would ever think that these switches up here control all the exterior lights? Or that the engine restart buttons are found here and not in the engine room? Yeah, I'm not ashamed to admit that I spent nearly 15 minutes scouring both the engine and switch rooms for some way to restart them after they lost power. There's even individual gauges depicting the status of every last room within the ship, alongside buttons to run automated pumps in them. And then there's also this entire panel up here that contains like 20 different named switches which had no discernible use, as far as I could tell. I did manage to get familiar with most of the sub's features by the end of the demo, but there were definitely periods of time where I had no idea what to do. If you look back on Iron Lung, a couple people complained that the controls were too complex. Well, those people would have no chance playing Full Fathom. There are a few notes offering tips on what to do, along with a journal that lists your next objective at the most basic level, but it's still very easy to get lost. I mean, the objectives don't even hint at what area you need to go to on the map, so coming back to this game after a break would be a nightmare. The game uses a node-based map slightly reminiscent of the one in Iron Lung, but it took me a while to realize that you don't actually control the sub. Well, at least not in the sense that you can just drive wherever you want. Instead, you have to get floppy disks which provide paths to link the coordinates on your map. You then type in what coordinates you want to go to, and the sub navigates automatically. It's up to you to control the speed, but you don't actually turn it left and right or anything. And even though you can get out to free swim at any point, you can't actually drive the sub to a location unless you've unlocked it on your map. So theoretically you could swim to undiscovered locations, but practically that's not really possible given how limited your oxygen supply is. I don't know what the actual time is, but it felt like I had about 30 to 60 seconds of oxygen, which was barely enough time to explore an area, grab some loot, and then make a mad dash back for the sub. Some of the bigger structures you visit have oxygen tanks inside to offset this, but many of them don't, severely limiting your exploration time. You can swim faster with a neat little mini game where you time button presses to your swimming strokes, but even after figuring that out, I still felt very restricted on time. A lot of the locations you come across are pretty interesting from afar. Stuff like submerged houses, a storage complex, and even a sunken city. But once you make it inside, they're pretty bare, usually just featuring a couple rocks, boxes, and a container or two you can dig through for some loot. Of course, this is still an early demo build, but the interiors are something I'd like to see them expand on more in the future. The exteriors are cool and make me want to check out these areas, but the interiors feel rather empty on both the world building and gameplay fronts. As much as we all love to make fun of Fallout's environmental storytelling skeletons, I think they do add a little bit of character to the world. Not that you ever have that much time to really check out these buildings because of the limited oxygen I mentioned earlier. Hopefully they'll either expand this or allow you to upgrade your tanks in the future so you aren't rushing back to your sub every 20 seconds or so. Likewise, I think the swimming controls need a little more polish to make the exterior experience less of a hassle. Subnautica is a great source of inspiration here because it's one of the few games where swimming doesn't feel terrible, even if it's not entirely realistic. In full Fathom, the character jostles around constantly in the water, making navigating small doorways and interior spaces kind of a pain. The easiest way to put it is that the movement just feels very imprecise and floaty, and I'm well aware of the irony in saying that an underwater game feels floaty. But it's not the good kind of floaty like Subnautica, where the effect largely happens in the camera, and your movement is otherwise pretty precise. This is the kind of floaty where you're constantly getting stuck on things trying to navigate the countless small spaces the game throws at you. Anyways, I know it might sound like I'm listing off complaints here, but Full Fathom is a pretty unique game so far, even within the submarine horror genre. But speaking of horror, I didn't really touch on that part just yet. Like you might have guessed, we've got all sorts of weird undersea creatures to encounter within the limited scope of the demo. There's harmless fish just swimming around, patrolling giant killer eels, kaiju-sized stomping crabs, and even some bioluminescent monsters lurking in the deep. I'm not sure if these creatures can attack the sub directly, but they can definitely eat you when you're out for a swim. In fact, my only death in the game was when I plunged to the dark depths of the sunken city in the sub's handy gondola. I turned on my lamp to get a better look around before presumably being eaten by some completely silent fish right behind me. Speaking of which, aside from the stomping crabs, the sea life was oddly quiet. Not to constantly reference Subnautica, but the Reaper screams are easily one of the most terrifying parts of that game. So it's kind of odd to know that all these threats are lurking out there, but you never really hear from them. On the other hand, the monsters were pretty neat so far, so I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what else they come up with. I assume this demo takes place in the earlier parts of the game, which is why most of the areas you visit are brightly illuminated and devoid of threats. But even just judging the game on the spooky city segment, there's a lot of potential for some genuinely scary moments as things progress. But that's enough about the horror elements. What else is going on in this demo? Well, I love the VHS style UI they've made. Sure, a bunch of indie games have done VHS UI before, but I've yet to see one so complex and aesthetically pleasing as this one. Yeah, it's a lot of information that you largely don't need to see, but it makes for a pretty cool immersive element. Also on the design front, this prologue section where you're in a small storage room has a ton of very cool details. Like this fire exit door poster that tells you it will exit the game, or this World War II era propaganda poster that brings you to the Steam page for the game. Likewise, there's a rotating billboard outside that features games from other indie devs, and interacting with that also brings you to their Steam pages. But best of all is this retro security alarm that lets you adjust the game settings. Navigating these old school LCD menus was a real throwback, and the execution was spot on. Full Fathom is absolutely packed with tiny little details like this that you know the devs put a lot of time into, but most people will just look at for a second or so. And I love seeing stuff like that in games, so huge props to them for going the extra mile. Overall, this was a pretty promising demo. The submarine stuff felt nicely fleshed out, and I'm sure it'll only get better with time. On the other hand, the exterior gameplay probably needs the most love, from improving the player controls to making the explorable areas more interesting. There's definitely going to be a lot of work to do there. But I liked what I saw so far, and I'm happy I finally got a chance to check it out firsthand. This is definitely one I'm going to be checking back on later down the line. In the meantime, if you're looking for more videos on games like Iron Lung, Subnautica, and lots of other stuff in that genre, just check out some of my past videos. But speaking of horror, I have been cooking up some big stuff behind the scenes lately, and if all goes well, there might be some spooky stuff on the horizon. Or not. You never know. I guess you'll just have to stick around and see.